Hello. Thank you very much for watching. Hope that you are doing well today. This is a follow-up video, a part two, to trying to give what I would say is sort of just a general overview to the Old Testament. And something that my wife actually pointed out to me after I did part one was that I didn't go into specific points of scripture, which is something that I always do in like my written sermon outlines or in the videos that I do. I always want to, if there's a particular section of the Bible that say we're focusing on, I always want to back up and look at the other sections of text that God sort of points me to that are supporting, because it ties into how it all just sort of fits together. In this instance, part of the reason that I'm not doing those specific points of scripture, I'm trying to give it more of a broad historical overview, a broad view of the book, and touch on the points that I'm more familiar with and that I think a lot of people are familiar with, at least in passing, and maybe elaborate on just the backstory of those a little bit. But I'm trying to maintain as high of a view as I can and not get into too many particulars or too deep into the weeds. And ultimately, I want this, if you're watching this, I would want this to encourage you to read your Bible, because I mean that's how you progress, that's how you learn. I'm not going to by any means teach you everything you need to know. Uh, Receiving salvation is so simple. It's so easy. Acknowledging the truth of God, the need in your life for a Savior. That's such a simple thing to do, to approach with childlike faith. But what gets complicated, what can require some work and some attention and some devotion and obedience, is continuing on in the sanctification process. And you do that so much by reading your Bible. So I want to encourage you in that, but I wanted to just touch on that as to why I'm not getting too particular with some of this. So in the first video, we went through uh, the beginning of Genesis and creation on through the book of Genesis, and we got into the beginnings of Exodus. And the last thing I touched on was the Passover. So to kind of continue on from there and with familiar themes. So you have Moses sent by God to liberate the people of his people from Egypt. Egypt at one point in time was a good place for them to live, and it has become a place of slavery and oppression for them. So the Pharaoh, God hardens his heart, or in certain sections of the text, you'll read that Pharaoh hardens his heart. And I've actually heard some discussion on that, that the translation and the hardening of the heart has to do with almost a strengthening of the heart. That in essence, Pharaoh didn't want to let the people go, and that in hardening and strengthening his heart, he just increases his own conviction to not let them leave. And at that point, what Moses was going to him and saying was, hey, let the people go for a period of time. We're going to sacrifice and worship our God, and we'll come back. And that was a lie, because they were leaving and they were staying gone. But so ultimately, after the Passover, after the death of all of the male firstborns in Egypt, uh, that have not gone through what I talked about before of the sacrificing of the lamb, the painting of the blood on the doorposts. After this has happened, Pharaoh is brokenhearted and he's angry, and there's finally that, just fine, go, just get out of here. And so the Israelites get out of Egypt. And shortly after they left, Pharaoh's like, wait, what did I do? I just gave away a whole bunch of free labor. We're going after them. And it's at this point where the big famous reference point here that I would assume most people have heard at some point in time is the parting of the Red Sea. They're actively being pursued by the Egyptians, and Moses turns to God and is like, what do I do? And God's like, what do you mean, what do I do? Hold your staff out. Like, it, it always is funny to me, and I try not to blame the people of Israel too much, but it's always funny the exasperation that God seems to have at certain points of time, where it's like, what do we do? And it's like, what do you mean, what do you do? Do you see everything that I have done for you up to this point and everything that I have provided? I got you. Just go. So he parts the Red Sea. They cross over. The Egyptians go into the rift that has been created in the water, and then the wind ceases, the water closes back up, and you have a bunch of dead Egyptians. So that happens. That I feel like that's a pretty big deal. To witness that would be a pretty faith affirming event to have happen. So that takes place, and then they progress into the wilderness. And I've mentioned this in some of my other videos. It's constantly it says that the Israelites regularly they grumble. They grumble against Moses. They grumble against God. They're just a grumbly people. They're whiny. They say on more than one occasion when facing certain hardships, whether it's from other people groups that come out and attack them, whether it's from just the hardships of no longer being in a city or a civilized area and needing food. It's always like, would have been better to just die a slave in Egypt. Why'd you bring us out here to die in the wilderness? And it's at a certain point in time, their rebellion grows so much that there's one instance in particular. It's Korah's rebellion, where they've decided they're just going to overthrow Moses. They're going to overthrow their current leaders. They're going to kill them. They're going to name their own leaders, and they're just going to go back to Egypt. And God literally opens the ground and swallows the leaders of the rebellion and their families. Which I had a friend ask me one time, like, I'm always leery of trying to trivialize God's actions too much, because God obviously has complete sway over anything and everything, but nature. So I had a friend say, well, do you think it would have just been so like just an earthquake and then the ground opens and they fall in? And I was like, no. In my mind, it's like a like, and they're just swallowed. They're gone. It's more drastic because it's God. There's that finality to it there. But so big things that happen in the wilderness. Moses begins receiving the law to actually institute with the people of Israel, because they're having a lot of issues concerning rebellion and be it the worship of other gods, and they'll interact with another people group. And in particular, when the men start to interact with that people group's women and have certain relations with them, suddenly they start worshiping other gods. Once again, you would, and I try not to be too hard on them, you would think after seeing your God part the sea, you cross through and then it swallows up your enemies, that you would have faith beyond offering your worship to a false idol. But we do it. We do it today. God will miraculously deliver us from something. He'll pour out his mercy or his grace upon us, and then we'll give our worry or our attention to something lesser, something worldly. We'll get distracted. So there are so many important lessons to learn from the nation of Israel and their multiple rebellions. But I never get too cocky about it, because we mess up too. We mess up in the exact same ways. So God gives Moses the law, Mount Sinai, which gets referenced in hospitals and just in general. I usually just think hospitals, but it's a site of religious historical significance. This is the mountain where God gives Moses the Ten Commandments. Well, Moses is up on the mountain with God, receiving the law, receiving this information. I believe it's for 40 days that he spends up there interacting with God. And the people of Israel waiting at the base of the mountain turn to Aaron, who kind of has a right-handish sort of quality to Moses. He's the chief of the priests. Turn to him and they're like, well, we don't know what happened to Moses. He's been up there for a hot minute. We need something to worship. So make us an idol to worship. And this is where the golden calf comes from, which gets used a lot metaphorically. This is like that gets brought up, I feel like, common knowledge enough. But this is the story of where the golden calf originates. Moses comes back down the mountain, and what are the people doing? They're worshiping this false metal idol, and he breaks the tablets of the Ten Commandments, and he takes the golden calf and he incinerates it and scatters the ashes, if I'm remembering everything correctly. And he goes back up on the mountain. And honestly, for a really long time, I thought that, before I went in and read some of this, that the Ten Commandments were changed after that. I thought that Moses was given an original set of rules. He broke them in his fury, and then God gave him a new set of rules. It's the same Ten Commandments. God gave him a new set of tablets after he broke those. But so this is where we see this institution of the law. And Israel does here the same thing that they do once they become a nation and actually are settled in their own land. So we go through a period of time of the wilderness where we see rebellion and then we see returning to God, and rebellion and then returning to God. And there's one of the famous stories that gets told because Jesus actually references this during his ministry. He makes reference to that he must be lifted up as Moses lifted the serpent in the wilderness. There's a point in time where the people of Israel are grumbling against God, and God sends snakes, poisonous snakes, to bite them, and a ton of the people of Israel are dying. And what Moses does is he takes a serpent, he takes a staff, he makes a bronze serpent, lays it, and in a lot of representations I've seen, it's actually a cross that he does this with. But he takes a staff, he takes a stick, he puts the serpent on it, and anyone who is bitten who looks upon this is healed. That's also where that story takes place over the sequence of the Bible, is during this period in the wilderness. But so they've been in the wilderness, they're going to enter the promised land. They send spies, one of whom was Joshua, who goes on to succeed after Moses, goes into the promised land, comes back and reports, and they've observed giants. They've observed nations with, we would say, tactical or militaristic like superiority to them. And Joshua and one of his fellows are like, we got this. God's going to deliver him into our hand. God's going to, we can do this. And a lot of the people of Israel are ready to rebel again. They're like, well, no, we can't fight them. We can't do that. And they doubt God and they blaspheme against God in their doubt. And what God lays down at this point is, okay, fine. All of you who are grumbling, all of you who are talking smack, everybody who is above the age of manhood. If I'm remembering everything correctly, in this instance, it would have been everybody who is above 18, like 18 or above. None of you get to enter the promised land. And this is when we spend the 40 years in the wilderness. Moses himself even getting to go up on a mountain and view and see the promised land and see what would be realized there, but not actually getting to enter the promised land. So we finally we go through that whole period of time where there's still this cyclical rebellion and return. We finally enter the promised land, which is where like the Battle of Jericho takes place with Joshua and the Israelites just walking around the city and the walls literally collapsing, God just tearing down the walls of the city for them. And you have this period of conquest, but because of their idol worship, because of their lack of full commitment to God, they don't even get the whole promised land at one time. They end up having to share it with the Philistines, with the Midianites, with these different people groups that are against them, that constantly sort of plague them. And it's during this period of time, after the death of Joshua, that we get into the book of Judges. And Judges is exactly what it sounds like. At certain points, God will raise up an individual to serve as a judge over Israel, and it's after they have submitted before God and returned to God, and he'll raise up a judge and he'll drive out the foreign people group or the neighboring people group that are oppressing them, give them the land that was promised to them. And then what happens? Well, they get happy, they get complacent, things are good now, and they start to turn away from God again, and then these surrounding people groups get used to punish and oppress and ultimately turn the people of Israel back to God. Of this, because there are multiple judges over the course of many, many years in Israel, but the most famous one, the one that I feel like is probably by far the most pop culture referenced and known, is going to be Samson. The biggest story there being Samson and Delilah. So this is something that I was doing a little bit of research on and I found sort of fascinating. If you know the story there, you have Samson. He has incredible physical strength. He is hooking up with Delilah, and she asks him a few different times, what is the secret to your great strength? And for example, at one point in time, he tells her, if I'm bound with a a certain kind of rope, my strength will leave me. Well, his enemies jump him and they tie him up with that rope, and he tears the rope and he commences to just straight murdering these guys. It's something that didn't dawn on me until recently, while I was kind of reading through my study Bible, in particular reading through the section that introduces us to Judges. So I, to be completely honest, always looked at Samson and I loved his stories. My grandpa used to read me, Samson and him striking down 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey when I was a little kid, because grandpa knew what was going to appeal to a young kid who maybe was going to get bored with something else. Hey, I wanted to hear violence of action. I wanted to hear something going down. And so I heard a good bit of Samson when I was young, but I always thought a couple things. I always thought that for all intents and purposes, he just had magic hair, because it's ultimately his hair being cut and his strength leaves him. So I always just kind of assumed, okay, yeah, he's just got magic hair. And I always assumed that for all intents and purposes, without saying it directly, that he was just a brain dead idiot. And saying that, it's that I thought that he actually, and this is my interpretation, this is kind of how I'm feeling led in this, I thought that he legitimately trusted Delilah, even though he gives her information a good 2 or 3 times that she very clearly betrays him with. And I know men will do stupid things when it comes to women, but it just seemed so dumb that he keeps telling her stuff. And what I realized, what's been sort of laid on me, is that Samson didn't have magic hair, so to speak. And I think that what lost his strength was more so a sin of pride than anything else. And what I mean by this is there is something that's covered in the Old Testament called the Nazirite vow. I used to get really confused on this because Jesus is called a Nazarene because he's from Nazareth. That's where he predominantly grew up. And in my brain, I was like, Nazarene, Nazarite, it sounds, I never really distinguished between the two. The Nazarite vow is a vow of separation. It is purposefully and willingly setting yourself aside to God. And it's typically something that's done willingly, but in the instance of Samson, and later we'll get to Samuel, these are people that were dedicated to God from birth. So Samson had like this Nazarite vow laid upon him from birth. Part of this vow is you don't cut your hair. It's typically a voluntary period of time. So you're abstaining from certain food. There's a big thing about not touching the dead, not being, even if a family member were to pass, not being near a dead body, because it makes you ritualistically unclean by the Levitical standards. So there's that element, but the whole thing is during this period of time, your hair grows. And actually, if you were to, let's say this sounds like a weird thing to even say. Let's say you accidentally touch a dead body, you would shave your head and you would start over. But so what I see playing out here now, what I have a better perspective on now, I feel like, is Samson probably knew she was going to cut his hair or have his hair cut. Like everything else that he has revealed to her has happened to him. So I think that what we're seeing is a place of pride and complacency, because he also was, of course, not shy about touching the dead. There's a point in time where he actually like takes some honeycomb out of the corpse of a lion that he's killed. And in thinking about that doesn't really sound fitting with the other like food purity laws. So I think that what we're seeing is this pride and this confidence, this cockiness from Samson of, I'm strong. What do I have to worry about? I'm strong. God made me strong. I'm just bullet point, finish it, strong. And in that, he loses that when he does this, the cutting of the hair directly forsaking that Nazirite vow and what he has been ascribed to from birth, and being made judge and being given this authority and this power to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So ultimately, he's shamed and he's humbled and his eyes are gouged out and he's made into a slave. And then eventually, there's a short version of the story. There's a big party. They shackle him up between these two pillars. There are all these Philistines, and he prays to God to just allow him to destroy these Philistines and allow him to die with them. And he pushes the pillars down and the place collapses. And it says that he killed in that one occurrence more Philistines than he had killed in his entire life up to that point. So that is, people hear Samson and Delilah. People hear, and I can even think of songs and places where it's just sort of referenced as a snippet. But that is the more in-depth situation of what's going on there and where it's occurring as it's taking place in Judges. Now, what happens after Judges is ultimately the prophet Samuel is, if Judges, and then you, sorry, brain tapped out there for a second. You get into 1st and 2nd Samuel. Ruth takes place between that, but Ruth sets things up for 1st and 2nd Samuel to take place. Samuel is a prophet. He is made as judge over Israel, and Israel wants a king. Now, they are told before any of this happens, Samuel tells them the issues that they're going to have with having a king. The interesting thing about this, and I didn't piece this together until recently, another thing that I took away from kind of delving into my study Bible, in Leviticus and in the Old Testament books with Moses, where the law is being laid out, there are laws given around having kings. God always knew, always planned, it was always part of what was going to happen, was that Israel was going to have a king over them. So why would Samuel caution them against having a king? Why would he tell them that there's going to be backlash to them having a king presiding over them? And you don't really have to look far, knowing that God is perfect, doesn't contradict himself. Sometimes it's not about what you're doing, it's about why. So why were the people asking for a king? Well, because they wanted to be like other nations. There was this sort of envy, this sort of desire to look like the other nations, like the other people groups, and they wanted a king. They wanted someone specific set over them. So they do. Their first king is Saul. Things don't go all that great with Saul. He is not a good king. What this leads to, though, is David, King David, being put in place. And the two, I would say, the most famous thing concerning David, I would say, has to be David and Goliath. That is referenced more times than I can count. Like that is just such a known, I would argue that is probably one of the most famous biblical stories in general. So to dive into this a little bit more, you have Saul. Saul is king. He is conquesting against other people groups. He's having some successes, and Israel goes up against the Amalekites. The Amalekites were the first people group to beset and attack Israel right when they're fresh out of Egypt. They're at their most vulnerable, and they attack God's people. So they are going up against the Amalekites, and God tells Saul, wipe them out. Wipe them out from the earth entirely. And it can sound, I would imagine, brutal, especially to us now, but this is a pagan people group who has pointedly set themselves against God and against his people. So man, woman, child, beast, wipe them out completely. This is the specific instruction that God gives to Saul. Saul doesn't listen. He saves the king of the Amalekites so that he can basically humiliate him. He gives the people some of the livestock and some of the taking basically a spoil of war. And what does he do to sort of, in stoking his ego, what does he do to make himself feel better about it? He takes some of the animals and sacrifices them to God, which is where there's a verse in 1 Samuel, I believe it's in 1 Samuel 16, where Saul is in essence saying, what's the big deal? Hey, look, I'm sacrificing these animals. And Samuel tells him to obey is better than the fat of rams. What is good before God is listening to what he has told you to do, not giving him what you just imagine you think he wants. Because you did what you wanted, now I'm just going to give him his piece. It goes back to an element of full surrender there. So from that point, God is like, I'm done with Saul. I'm done with him. And there's a point in 1 Samuel where God says to Samuel, man, how long are you going to keep moping around about Saul? I'm done with that dude. Go and see Jesse in Bethlehem. One of his sons, I have made one of his sons who will be a king for me. And it's David. It's the youngest of Jesse's sons, and he's a young shepherd boy. So Samuel anoints him, and nothing really happens immediately. There's a point in here where the people of Israel are going to war with the Philistines again. They're fighting it out. David's older brothers are, of course, fighting, and David's father Jesse sends him and is like, hey, take some of these provisions to your brothers, speak to their commanders, find out how the battle goes. And at this point, they're kind of at a locked up stalemate facing each other. And at the Philistines, their mighty warrior is Goliath. He's stepping out to the front, and he is challenging them in their weakness. And if their God is real, and if they really can stand before him, come on out, fight me man to man. We'll do a 1v1, and whoever wins is the winner instead of the armies going out. And the people of Israel are just trembling in their boots. And David hears this, and having a heart that, despite his pitfalls at certain points in time, is ultimately aimed at God and doing what is pleasing to God, he is livid. He is furious over hearing what this Philistine is saying against his God. And so the men are talking, oh, whoever defeats this Philistine, he'll be praised, he'll have riches, he'll have, and one of David's brothers gets mad at him. Oh, are you thinking, why aren't you with the sheep? You're sitting here daydreaming about the glory and riches you can have for yourself. But we see that David's aim is not that, it's at what is right before God. And so David ends up saying, I'll go face this guy. I'm paraphrasing all here, of course. But David says, I'll go face this guy. Let's throw down. And so Saul is like, hey, you're going to fight him? Bro, here's some sword. Here's some sword. Here's a sword. Here's some armor. Get out there and do your thing, man. And David has even told him when Saul's like, can you really do this? And I love this part. David, our shepherd boy, says, hey, when I'm watching my father's flock and a bear or a lion comes and takes one of the sheep, God has given me strength to go take that sheep back from the mouth of this predatory animal and break that predator. So if God has empowered me to stand before a bear or a lion with my bare hands and break and destroy this animal and reclaim this sheep to safety, I got this Philistine. So he puts on the armor, he takes the sword, and he's like, I can't use this. This isn't familiar to me. Can't use this. And so what does he do? He goes to the stream, he takes 5 stones, and he stands before Goliath. And Goliath is pissed at even seeing this young, attractive boy standing before him like, hey, what's up? So what does David do? He smokes Goliath with that sling. Here's the part that I didn't know in my children's Bible until I got older and started reading this stuff more in depth. And to me, this is like just the final, just flag in the sand. I love this part for the brutality against this person who has spoken out so aggressively against God. David then runs up to the slumped body of Goliath. He takes Goliath's sword. He cuts off Goliath's head and holds it up before all the Philistines. So they can see that their mighty champion, their one who blasphemed so much against the nation of Israel, just got wrecked. And then the Philistines turn, they flee, the Israelites pursue them, they rout them. And so this takes place, and we have an instance occur here where David is now very much in Saul's favor. But over time, that starts to wear off. Saul becomes jealous, he becomes moody, there are issues with his reign, and he has this jealousy. There's a deep and beautiful friendship between David and Jonathan, who is Saul's son, and just things sicken more and more with Saul to the point where David goes from being his boy to he wants to kill David, and David goes on the run for a period of time. And to jump ahead a little bit, and we'll get to this more later, but the book of Psalms, which is largely written by David, there are Psalms in there where you hear David struggling with the fact that Saul is seeking and pursuing and trying to kill him. Now, something that is interesting is they're made into enemies, but skipping ahead a little bit, and I've probably gotten a little too deeper into the weeds with all of this than I intended to originally, but I've always really liked David. I've always really liked his story. It's always just resonated with me, and I've always really appreciated that. So, but to jump a little bit through David's reign, during the time of being on the run and kind of getting a group of men who support him and around him, and Saul pursuing him and chasing him, there are two different occasions. One is where Saul steps into a cave to relieve himself, and another, and David is in the cave, and David cuts off a piece of Saul's clothing, and then shows to Saul after he leaves this cave. He's like, "Hey, I could have killed you. I didn't kill you." And that is one interesting thing: is David he seeks to preserve his own life, but he never seeks to kill Saul, because even with God turning away from Saul, even with him anointing David to be king, David still acknowledges that Saul is God's anointed, and he's not going to lift his hand against the man that God has anointed as his own in that regard. And I always thought that was kind of beautiful, in the fact that God put David in a position of enough security where he could do that. God affirmed David there where he could be merciful. But so the second time, David literally goes into Saul's entire camp while he's asleep. And if I remember right, he takes a jug of water that was sitting right by his head. And then it always throws Saul off balance, because he's like, "Yeah, I'm going to kill you." And then David's like, "Hey, I was standing right next to you while you were asleep, and I took this, and I didn't hurt you, didn't touch a hair on your head." David's devotion to Saul and him being respect toward him being anointed in that regard is so profound and so deep that when Saul is actually killed, is overrun during a battle by the Philistines, and ultimately falls on his own sword to avoid being captured and tortured, presumably by this opposing group, there's a guy who goes before David and says, "Hey," he's thinking he's going to get a reward. He's like, "Hey, I'm the one who killed Saul. What happened was the Philistines were upon us," and he turned to, because Saul tried to get one of his attendants to kill him, and the guy was like, "Not doing it. Nope, you are God's anointed. I am not doing it." And so that was what led Saul to fall on his own sword. But this guy tells David, "Yep, I killed them. They were going to come, and they were going to take him and torture him." And he looked at me and said, "Hey, will you kill me so that I don't have to suffer this?" So I struck him down. And this guy's like, "Yeah, I'm going to get rewarded." And David's like, "Cool story, bro. Take that dude outside and kill him." So did not go at all the way that guy thought it was going to. But we have, over the course of David's reign, and there's a lot to go into there, I would say that the most famous story of him as a king, and I'll touch on this, and then I'll probably go ahead and close out for today, and we'll pick this back up in a part 3, because I feel like I'm getting a little rambly, and I apologize for that. But the story here that I feel like is known somewhat far and wide is David and Bathsheba. So maybe you're familiar with that, those names at the very least, to give a little bit of backstory, a little bit of insight, some depth as to, so that, once again, looking at things chronologically, David and Goliath, it takes place well before David has actually become king. David and Bathsheba take place after he has been affirmed and is actually acting as king over Israel. So what's happening? He's in his home. He's in his palace of whatever that would have looked like at that point in time. And he sees a woman bathing on the roof, and completely just beset and consumed by his lust, he's like, "Yeah." So he's king. He reaches out to her. She comes to him. He's like, "Hey, let's do this." Once again, paraphrasing. But The two of them have relations. What happens? She gets pregnant. And David's like, this is it's weird and a little twisted to say, but this is something that I've always liked about David is this man whose heart is turned fully to God for all of his faults, for all of his issues. He is, for being a very successful man of war, he is turned fully to God. And when he does stumble, he sees the transgressions of what he's done against God, but he doesn't, for all the beautiful Psalms and for all the things that he does and his desire to build God a temple, which he doesn't get to realize, but his desire to do so, this story being so messed up and so horribly wrong, it humanizes him some. And the thing is he gets broken because of it, and he acknowledges what it is that he's done wrong, and it leads him to turn immediately back to God. So what happens? He has relations with Bathsheba. She gets pregnant. And he's like, what am I going to do? So his master plan is, I'm going to call her husband back from the battlefield and give him basically a weekend leave, and he'll be so happy. Of course, he and his wife are going to lie with one another, and then he'll think that he got her pregnant, and boom, I'm good. So he does this, and Uriah the Hittite is her husband. He is so devoted to David. David's like, sweet, man, good job. You're doing great out there. Go home and see your wife. And he's like, nope, you're my king. I'm devoted to you. You're my man. I'm sleeping at your palace door. I'm staying right here. I'm not going home. So David's like, well, alrighty then. I'm going to have to find a way to get you killed to avoid the whole backlash that this situation is going to create. So what does he do? He gives Uriah a letter to give to his commander for Uriah to be put at the very front of the battle, and then everybody else just kind of pull away and just let him get smoked. And that is exactly what happens. And ultimately, because of the sin of David in this instance, the child dies, is born sickly, and then dies. And during this period of time when the child lays ill, David fasts and weeps and tears his clothes, and he is in a state of pure mourning. And after the child passes, he rises and he washes himself, and he goes on about his business, and his servants are really confused why he was in a state of mourning while the child was sick, but then seems fine once the child has passed. And he in essence says that while the child laid ill, there was a possibility that he would be saved. There was a possibility that God would blot out my transgression and heal the child. But now that he is gone, he's gone to God. He is, and I'll follow him one day. He's gone where I'm going, and there's nothing to, in essence, worry about anymore. But that is and ultimately in the aftermath of that, and her husband passing and everything happening with the baby, David does take Bathsheba as a wife, but it even says because David had multiple wives, which is another thing we can talk about at some point in time. But whenever we see a list of David's wife, it even notes her as the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So it still pays attention to the origin there. We don't just sweep that under a rug and ignore it. So that is the more complete story of David and Bathsheba as far as that is concerned. So I will, there's some more to touch on with David, and then kind of continuing on through the Kings and the pattern of things that unfolds there. May have gotten a little too in the weeds on this, but hopefully you took something away from it, and it's all stuff that I feel pretty passionate about and feel blessed to be able to speak on it all. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one, God willing, and I hope you are well. Thank you.